It is the year 2050, and despite a unified effort to reach net zero, the impacts of climate change can be felt across the globe. Frequent droughts and storms have destabilized global food production, and 80% of the Maldives has been submerged by rising sea levels. Coral reefs only exist in aquaria and through the lens of David Attenborough's memoirs. Meanwhile, a reduction in habitable land space has created hundreds of millions of climate refugees, and increased flooding and rainfall has intensified the prevalence of infectious diseases. While the journey seemed off to a promising start back in 2019, it soon became clear that the UK's net zero strategy, Build Back Greener, was severely underfunded, providing little support for the greening of large companies. The steel industry alone required £6 billion to reach net zero, and these costs only climbed as the funding was delayed and tax losses from the phase-out of diesel and petrol vehicles became evident. The scarcity of green schemes to promote the adoption of heat pumps and insulation allowed the persistence of the gas boiler and our dependence on fossil fuels. 46 new oil and gas projects skirted past the climate compatibility checkpoint, the UK's fossil fuel regulatory system, and these are currently extracting enough fossil fuels to release a further 900 million tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Unfortunately, the UK hedged its bets on the development of novel carbon dioxide removal technologies, which didn't materialise at the scales necessary due to unforeseen technological limitations and extravagant costs. Most companies avoided meaningful emissions reductions by compensating with unregulated offsetting overseas, which created no long-term reduction in atmospheric carbon dioxide concentration. As a result, the carbon budget has long been surpassed, and global atmospheric warming is approaching 2 degrees. This is a future well within the scope of the UK's net zero strategy, and unravelling how this future might come to be will reveal why the pitfalls of net zero are crucial to understanding the current link between climate science and policy. To start our journey of exploration, we must first ask, what does net zero mean? The concept of net zero emerged from physical climate science, but is operationalised through social, political and economic systems. In this way, net zero represents the intersection between climate science and climate policy. The idea of net zero in policy can be traced back to an informal group of women policymakers, climate activists and lawyers, who, after witnessing the failure of the Copenhagen Climate Summit, met in 2013 to discuss an ambitious yet achievable target for climate action. It's based on the idea of a finite carbon budget, whereby we can only afford to emit a specific amount of additional carbon into the atmosphere if we're to limit warming to safe levels. For a 50% chance of limiting warming to less than 1.5 degrees, we have a remaining carbon budget of around 400 to 800 gigatons of carbon dioxide. Beyond this carbon budget, no further emissions can be released, or they must be balanced by carbon dioxide removal, thus reaching a state of net zero emissions. Once CO2 emissions have been halted, the temperature will be maintained due to the balance of the cooling effect of carbon dioxide absorbed by land and ocean sinks, and the warming effect of the reduced ability of the ocean to absorb heat, which balance out to maintain a constant temperature. This is interesting, but what makes it crucial to the link between climate science and policy? Well, this can be explained by the sheer scale at which it's been adopted into climate policy at all levels. Climate policy and targets historically focused on either stabilising greenhouse gas concentrations, which was the aim of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change in 1992, or alternatively, policy aimed to limit carbon dioxide to a specific amount. For instance, the Kyoto Protocol in 1997 aimed to limit 6 greenhouse gases to 5.2% below their 1990 levels. Unfortunately, the Kyoto Protocol failed to engage the world's largest and fastest growing economies and excluded developing countries from binding targets, and neither of these policies was translated into mass climate action. After the inception of the net zero concept in 2013, it was adopted by the Paris Climate Agreement in 2015, which championed limiting warming to less than 2 degrees, but with efforts to remain below 1.5. They hope to do this by achieving a balance between anthropogenic sources and sinks of greenhouse gases in the second half of the century, aka by reaching net zero. Shortly after this debut, net zero trickled down into all levels of policy and came to dominate our approach to climate action. The UK was the first country to declare a legally binding net zero target in 2019, which was later translated into the net zero strategy Build Back Greener in 2021. And now, in 2022, 134 countries and 694 of the world's 2,000 largest companies have net zero targets, and these account for 88% of global emissions, 90% of GDP, and 85% of the world's population. Now, this all sounds very promising, and net zero has clearly been effective at simplifying complex science and an overwhelming task into one clear goal, which has permeated policy at all scales. However, it exhibits a number of pitfalls, and the way we choose to navigate these will ultimately determine our success in averting catastrophic climate change. These problems relate not only to aspects of climate policy and how it's delivered, but also an oversimplification of the scientific concepts. The problems with net zero involve a broad spectrum of issues, but can be summarised by these three categories. The first concerns the pathway to net zero. There are many different ways to reach net zero by 2050, and the IPCC has identified 200 of these, and they're not all equal. For instance, this graph shows how reducing our emissions at different rates can result in drastically different cumulative emissions and ultimately different levels of warming. In particular, leaving all the work until later on, which may be preferable to those with vested interests in the status quo, would result in much greater emissions and costs later on when more severe interventions would be needed. Unfortunately, although many companies, regions and countries have pledged to reach net zero by 2050, most have not specified how this will be done, and the UK has one of the most developed action plans, and even it does not yet include sufficient funding to deliver a rapid, front-loaded transformation. Secondly, the use of the word net introduces somewhat of a loophole, because as long as we can remove CO2 from the atmosphere, we can continue to emit it and still reach net zero emissions. This has led to a surge in interest in carbon offsetting and carbon dioxide removal. Unfortunately, carbon offsetting is unregulated, difficult to measure, and rarely results in long-term carbon storage. Carbon dioxide removal, on the other hand, relies on highly speculative negative emissions technologies, which have not yet been fully developed and would be required at unprecedented scales. Alternatively, carbon can be stored by the manipulation of natural carbon sinks, for instance by creating vast plantations, but these compete with food production and indigenous biodiversity. The net zero plans for companies and countries, where they exist, tend to be overly reliant on these carbon removal strategies to reach net zero. The idea of carbon dioxide removal helps sustain a belief in technological salvation and shrinks the sense of urgency, which prevents meaningful climate action and a move away from fossil fuels, and this is also referred to as mitigation deterrence. This is particularly stark in the UK's net zero strategy, which aims to employ carbon dioxide removal to absorb 30 to 50 million tonnes of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere every year, rather than tackling emissions head-on. A third and final pitfall category is that of emissions coverage. Countries have contributed differently to historic emissions and have varying capacities to transition away from fossil fuels based on their development level, and this is ignored by most net zero pledges, resulting in pathways that are unjust and unequitable. Furthermore, consumption-based emissions, i.e. those embodied in imports, are often not incorporated into net zero emissions targets, meaning large proportions of emissions go unaccounted. Finally, net zero targets often do not take into account other non-CO2 greenhouse gases, which all influence the atmospheric temperature in different ways. This graph shows the effect of limiting different non-CO2 greenhouse gases and emissions on atmospheric warming. The blue line shows the impact of reaching net zero carbon dioxide without limiting any other emissions, whereas the red line shows that when you also limit aerosols, this creates a warming effect which would actually cause us to exceed 1.5 degrees very quickly. The purple line indicates that by limiting all greenhouse gases and aerosols to net zero, we would limit warming to less than 1.5 degrees despite an initial period of warming. So clearly there are many challenges in pursuing net zero, but could it still be the answer? Well, with a few changes and guardrails, some scientists believe that net zero could be achieved in the right way to create a future that's very different from the one that opened this video. It is a year 2050, but let's start back in 2022, when scientists and policymakers called for a re-evaluation of global net zero efforts. They publicised the risks of relying too heavily on underdeveloped carbon removal technologies and offsetting, and instead encouraged a front-loaded rapid move away from fossil fuels. The UK scrapped the climate compatibility checkpoint and instead placed a moratorium on all new and pre-approved oil and gas fields, joining a raft of other countries like Costa Rica. Since the UK and other developed nations were responsible for most historic global emissions, they chose to change more rapidly to compensate for the slower transitions in developing nations, and this was encouraged by incorporating the concept of common but differentiated responsibility and respective capabilities. Carbon removal techniques were still developed, but as a complementary rather than a compensatory tool, and they were incorporated using the twin target approach and were mainly used to help developing nations. A comprehensive approach to emissions reductions meant all greenhouse gases and aerosols were tackled at once, providing additional benefits through cleaner air. This also meant tackling difficult emissions, not just the low-hanging fruit, and this included aviation, agriculture, and consumption-based emissions. Green initiatives made heat pumps and insulation available en masse, and green education schemes encouraged low-carbon dietary and lifestyle choices. Meanwhile, the UK saw the long-term benefits of investing in greening the economy, which created hundreds of thousands of new jobs. Money was saved by avoiding more severe interventions down the line, which combined with funds from road taxes and health improvements, could pay for a just transition for all those in the fossil fuel economy and the decarbonisation of large essential industries. Nationalising big energy companies made energy poverty a thing of the past. Meanwhile, free public transport and improved walking and cycling infrastructure led to a reduction in car use. Whilst rising sea levels were locked in, and unfortunately many island states have disappeared, a refocus of net zero plans to align with broader socio-ecological objectives recognise the rights of climate refugees to settle in any country with the rollout of climate visas. Frequent droughts and storms have caused regular small-scale disruptions in food production, but diversifying food sources, focusing on agroecology, and encouraging domestic food production has lessened these impacts. Indigenous biodiversity has benefited from countless rewilding schemes as we recognise the importance of nature and moved away from industrial agriculture, and 10% of coral reefs still exist and are under strict protection. This is what the world could look like if we follow the net zero guardrails set out by scientists Fankhauser and others. They outline the 7 criteria necessary to reach net zero in the right way, and these broadly aim to maintain the urgency of zero, uphold the integrity of net, and they strive for consistency with sustainable development objectives. The stark contrast between the futures described in this video demonstrate just how crucial it is that we address the pitfalls of net zero and make sure that we keep our guardrails up. Ultimately, our pathway to net zero will determine our success in limiting warming to less than 1.5 degrees. And since this topic was created in science and has come to dominate policy, I believe the pitfalls of net zero are crucial to understanding the current link between climate science and policy.